Trump is just like he's a classic schoolyard bully. And you have to stand up to a bully. And the more, if he takes your lunch money, at school one day and you just give it to him, he's gonna come back and take it the next day and the next day and the next day. He's not gonna stop until you stand up to him. Universities have to band together. It's not a time to be silent. It's a time that you have to push back and fight. And I know people feel fear, and honestly, I feel fear every day. Education should be the ultimate bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. We have a reading crisis in our country.
Do you ever drink the Arne Duncan? I poured a few because I wanted to ask you about it. Is this actually a thing?
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome back into the Sanity podcast. Dave Briggs here with Allison Camerata, giving you a little bit of sanity in this frankly insane world we're in which the Department of Education has become a punching bag. It's really surprising to me, Allison, when Donald Trump announced that he was shredding the department, it was a standing ovation, which I'm just fascinated how education became a political.
It's funny that you say that it was a surprise to you, because I remember when we were at Fox, Roger Ailes, I remember this being a political football for a long time and being a punching bag for a long time, that somehow the impression was that the Department of Education was way too bloated and that we were falling behind other countries. So it was this paradoxical situation that just became a kind of boogeyman. So I'm really looking forward to talking to our guest about how that happened.
And the concept of addition by subtraction. We have the perfect guest to talk about it. Arne Duncan, the 9th Secretary of Education under President Obama and a former professional basketball player in Australia. So we will talk a little bit of hoops before we let him get out of here. He is a managing partner at the Emerson Collective, which we'll also discuss. Mr. Secretary, great to have you on. Really appreciate it. Can you give us a little bit of backstory as a former Secretary of Education about how it became a political football, a punching bag for the red?
Yeah, I'll try and give a brief history lesson, because it wasn't always like this. And I always say education should be the ultimate bipartisan or nonpartisan issue. For me, there's nothing left to write about getting our babies to, ready to go to kindergarten with great high quality pre-K, and raising third grade reading scores, and raising high school graduation rates, and trying to lead the world in college completion. So I hate when it gets politicized. But I want to sort of explain to you how unprecedented what President Trump is doing in our nation's history is. So I want to talk to you about what some Republican presidents have done for education. I'll start with our first Republican president, President Lincoln, who during the Civil War created the land-grant colleges, which was extraordinary. Fast forward 70 years, President Eisenhower created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, so put education on the federal map. President Ford supported IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that put billions of dollars behind kids with special needs to make sure they have a free and fair education. President Nixon, lots of challenges to President Nixon, but guess what he signed into law? Pell Grants, which have been absolutely transformational to create, opportunity for young people, many first-generation college goers, to go to college. Both Bushes, pushed for, higher standards and more accountability, No Child Left Behind law. So actually, if you look at our nation's history, we have never had any president, but let alone a Republican president, attack the Department of Education and dismantle it like President Trump has. And so it's incredibly disheartening, quite frankly.
So Arne, is there bloat? I mean, in other words, is there, couldn't you have used a haircut? I know that Donald Trump is trying to dismantle the entire thing, but had over the years, after all of those presidents, the Department of Education lost its original mission or gotten too bloated?
I don't think it has. Now, everything could be more efficient. The department is actually the second smallest agency in the federal government, and actually handles, I think, the second largest amount of money. So you could actually say it's wildly more efficient than other places, but there's always room to cut. So I remember when I got there, somehow we had a department in France. We had an office in France and folks who staffed it. And I asked, could I go to France and not do this job and do that job? But they didn't let me do that. And so we closed the office in France and took that away. And so there's always something to do. But again, this is not a haircut. This is not about bloat. This is about dismantling and really creating chaos, which is, for me, because education is obviously so critical to our nation. It's our nation's interest. I really struggle with what's going on now.
It will take an act of Congress to officially eliminate the department, but President Trump said Linda McMahon will be the last Secretary of Education. What will be the consequences to you? How will this play out for people that are parents like us and parents around the country, for students, for grants, for civil rights, things of that nature?
Yeah, so first, you said exactly right. He cannot eliminate the department. The department was created by an act of Congress. It would take an act of Congress to close it, and that's never going to happen because Congress wouldn't allow that to happen. I highly doubt Linda McMahon will be the last Secretary of Education. Trump says lots of things that are not true. But what they have done already is tremendous damage, and they've stripped it to parts. And what they've done, or what they're contemplating doing it, is moving different pieces of it to different agencies. So you might move something to labor, and something to health and human services, and something to the IRS, something to small business association. But what that actually does is that creates a bureaucratic nightmare for states and districts. So we actually tried to do quite the opposite. When I was there, we created what we called a state desk, so that states and districts would have one number to call for whatever their education question was, and then we would navigate our bureaucracy to make sure they got the answer. But can you imagine if you're a state or district having to call 8 or 9 different federal agencies in DC and try and navigate it? It doesn't make any sense at all. The concern for me, for parents, which is really where the rubber meets the road, are a couple of things. First of all, we have a reading crisis in our country. If you saw the recent PISA scores, they are way, way, way too low. And there's not a single thing that President Trump has said or done or uttered or signed that helps one child in America learn to read. And if you talk to parents like yourselves, I'm a parent of 2 kids, and one's in college, one just graduated. Parents are concerned about 4 things. They're concerned about their kids' academic achievement. They're concerned about their mental health. They're concerned about bullying in schools, and they're concerned about mass shootings, gun violence. Again, nothing Trump has said or done addresses any of those issues. So it's a bunch of, honestly, performative, art, performance, making a performance that really doesn't address anything that actual parents like yourselves and, parents across the country are concerned about.
Arne, Dave and I both worked at Fox for several years, so we're very fluent in those talking points, and they're often not sort of supported by facts or by much research, but here it is. Here's the talking point that you could address. Well, we have a reading crisis. Obviously the Department of Education is not working. All the money, the federal money that's being poured into states, it's not working. We're falling behind. What do you say to that?
Yeah, and it's good. I really appreciate it. We should talk all this stuff through and have a really honest conversation. Hopefully that's good for your listeners, for your viewers. So for K-12 education, is you guys probably know 90% of the funding actually comes at the state and local level, and the federal investment is only about 10%. And so the fair question is, what does the federal U.S. Department of Education do? What it does is it adds additional resources to our nation's most vulnerable children. So it's more money for children who live below the poverty line. It's more money for children with special needs. It's more money for early childhood education. It's lunches. If you can't afford to buy lunch, it's lunches so you don't go hungry during the day. We talked about Pell Grants, grants and loans for college. And so it's actually very counterintuitive. You think about 10%, that's the minority investor. 90% of the funding, the majority investor by far, is the state and local government. So I'm never one to point fingers or cast blame. But if you actually wanted to blame someone for our low results, who do you blame? The 10% investor, or do you blame the 90% investor? You would actually blame the state and the local, because that's where most of the resources are coming from. So again, it's not an honest thing to say the federal government is investing a small amount of money to help the most vulnerable children, and it's somehow their fault that things aren't working at the state level. That's not real. And I just came back this week from Mississippi. Mississippi, we know how poor it is. We know all the challenges there. Mississippi got very, very focused on 4th grade reading, and they went from 49th in the country over a number of years to 21st. And for poor children, they went from 49th to 1st, to number 1 in the country for poor children reading at grade level in 4th grade. So I know what's possible when states do the right thing. I literally was there early this week. But when states don't invest, when they don't do the right thing, you see the kind of results we're seeing as a country.
It's really interesting you bring up Mississippi. Here are the 5 states most dependent on the Department of Education. Mississippi's number 1. South Dakota, Montana, Alaska, Arkansas, almost red states across the board. The 5 states least dependent upon the Department of Education: New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Mass, pretty much blue states across the board, which is interesting psychology. I mean, just interesting math to consider. they're hurting red states primarily. But you laid out what the department does or did. What will eliminating it do? What are the consequences?
Yeah, so again, to be clear, they're not going to eliminate. They cannot eliminate it. What they can do is dismantle it. So what they can do is create a lot of bureaucratic chaos that we talked about. I'll just say a couple of my biggest fears. So when I was there, the thing I worried about, every day was federal student aid, FSA, because that administers trillions of dollars to millions of students to go to college. And that was sort of my biggest operational risk. And I had a fantastic guy, Jim Runcie, running that, and that did well. What they have done is they've fired more than half the folks brought in to run that, and they're moving that supposedly to SBA. I really desperately hope this does not happen, but the chances for a massive operational failure as we go into the fall with college, for me, is just absolutely terrifying. And if someone asked me to come be the department, the Secretary of Education again today, I couldn't do it in good conscience because I couldn't take on that kind of operational risk. And the only analogy I can give you is like if the FFA eliminated half of the air flight controllers around the country, it wouldn't be safe to fly planes. And so that's a huge, massive risk that we have coming. And then what they've said is they want to just give on the K-12 side, they just want to give block grants to states. And when you just give states money, there's no accountability. That's a worry. I'll give you a positive Mississippi example. Let me give you a very negative one. As you remember, very recently, they took TANF money for really poor families who need help. The previous governor stole $77 million of that TANF money to build athletic stadiums for Brett Favre's daughter and others, and no accountability. And so for me, if they start to take Title I money from poor kids or money from rural kids, billions of dollars for rural kids or money for kids with special needs, they start to take that and do it for their pet projects with no accountability, that would be devastating. It's interesting, again, on Mississippi, I'm fluent in that just because I was down there this week. 95% of their funding for children with special needs, 7.5 million children around the country, 95% of that funding comes from the Department of Education. They don't really invest in it as a state in that, which is what you talked about. And so if that money starts to become funding money or money for politicians to do crazy things with it, those are our nation's most vulnerable children who are going to get hurt. And that for me is just morally and educationally absolutely bankrupt.
Arne, a couple more questions. Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio doesn't sound, at least publicly, concerned yet. I mean, he has basically said that he thinks that the bureaucracy and red tape, if those are eliminated at the federal level, he thinks it could be good on the local level. And basically the argument for doing this, if you believe the party line, is that it gives more control to the states. So is that true?
Yeah, again, it was funny. I always try and get below the talking points. I'm not sure your talking points. And I would ask him, give a very concrete example of where the bureaucracy is slowing you down. And you just need one more question below the talking point. And again, I would almost argue the counter that you need more accountability. All this money, to be clear, this is not President Trump's money. He is not a king. He is not a dictator. Doesn't matter what his aspirations are. All this money we're talking about is our money. It's our tax dollars. It's your money, and your guys' money, and my money, and all your listeners and viewers' money. And I think it's absolutely the right thing to do to help children with special needs, to help rural children, to help poor children have a chance to get a great education. But I never just want to give money for something. I want to have accountability. I want to know what those results are. And I want to make sure that money is actually helping folks. And I worry, again, if you just simply block grant and give the money to states, and there's no sense of accountability at the federal level, I worry that money won't be used well. And so I hear the talking point. We should always be looking to streamline bureaucracy and make things easier. But at the same time, for me, the goal is never just more money. More money is not the answer. Better results, like we saw in Mississippi, is the answer. And you need accountability to measure that and to know whether we're getting results, getting impact for our investment.
The stats, to President Trump's point, are staggering. Less than half of 4th and 8th graders are proficient in reading and math, both. That's proficient. What is the biggest problem? I know there's not a silver bullet. There's probably 30 or 40 or 50, but what's the single biggest issue?
Yeah, well, it's not that complicated. And again, we can all describe the problem. He can describe the problem, but what I just absolutely despise, frankly, about what's happening is I said there's not a single thing that he has done that helps one more child become proficient in reading. Nothing he has said or done. So what does work? Let me just say, we had tens of millions of children who were too far behind before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, those most vulnerable children fell even further behind. And I'm desperately worried about a lost generation. So we should all be focused. Again, this is not left or right or whatever. We should all be focused. How do we help more kids learn to read and to do math faster and better? That's what should unify our country right now. And there are two things, Dave. There aren't, it doesn't have to be 50. Two very concrete things. One, high dosage tutoring has proven to be incredibly effective of helping kids catch up. And states that have done that, districts that have done that, have seen large gains in reading, including my home city here, Chicago, but many other places as well. The second thing is, and again, this is just common sense stuff, is more time. And if any of us want to get good at anything, we just have to work harder. So children need more after school. They need more Saturdays. They don't need 3 months off in the summer. They need summer school. And so more time coupled with high dosage tutoring are extraordinarily effective in helping kids catch up. And we should all be making sure that children who need more help get that more help with real urgency.
But I have one more question before we move on to a couple other things. You mentioned the lost generation because of COVID. I see that in particular with my kids. I won't throw one under the bus, but it was a particular age group that really got impacted. How so? And what is that age bracket to you? Why did it impact them?
Yeah, and I don't know if there was a single age group. I just can't imagine, having a kindergartner, a first grader, a second grader, and trying to Zoom all day. It's like inconceivable to me from the child's standpoint and from the parents' standpoint. My two kids were in high school during that. I know it was very, very unhelpful, detrimental to them. But let me be clear: kids that have resources, kids that have well-educated parents, they survive these things better. It's not great for them, but they do better. But it's the kids that don't have that support. It's the kids that may not have had devices. It's the kids that may not have had a quiet space at home to concentrate. The most vulnerable kids who fell the furthest behind during the pandemic. And those are the children we all have to be working to help catch up as fast as we can.
Arne, I have a question about the unions. Donald Trump, the teachers' unions have been another boogeyman, and they think, particularly with COVID, they think that they were not acting in the best interest of the students always.
Which was the case in many parts of the country.
I mean, you can make that argument.
Teachers wanted to be home, and they wanted to stay remote, and Republicans wanted to get back in the classroom, and ultimately, they were probably right.
I think that in retrospect, maybe we can say that was right to get kids back sooner, but it was a deadly disease. And so there were also teachers who didn't want to die. And, I'm just saying.
I knew a lot of teachers that hid behind the union during that period that didn't do our kids any favors. I will just say.
No, I hear you. I think we all agree that it really hurt the kids. But I just remember before the vaccines that there was a fear of death. And so teachers weren't looking forward to getting back in the classroom and bringing it home to their aging grandparent or whatever. So, I think we remember what happened. But do you think that how does this affect the teachers' unions and what Trump's trying to do? And do you think that they've had too much power?
Yeah. So, so far what he has done, I don't think actually affects the unions. And so that's a good question, but I don't see any direct connection between anything he's done. And it's interesting. I think, as we know, this is always a local issue. So you have 15,000 school districts, you have 50 states, some came back faster, some came back slower. Some places unions are stronger, some places there are no unions. But it's interesting when you look at the data, again, I'm always looking like who recovered faster. One of the places that recovered the fastest is actually my hometown of Chicago, that has strong unions. They probably stayed out of school for too long. But if you look at the data, their recovery has been better than almost anybody. So the truth is more complicated, more complex. As I look around the country of who's recovered the fastest, some are places with less strong unions. Some are places with very strong unions. And so again, it's important to get below the talking points, and the data is very mixed there. So it's hard for me to draw a
Yeah.
conclusion one direction
But
or
when you
another.
say recover faster, you don't mean medically. You mean like the test scores have recovered?
Academically, correct.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not medically. Let me be
Yeah.
very clear. No, no, no. I'm not the doctor here. In terms of kids catching up, that learning lost during COVID, kids catching up, places like Chicago, where 95%, 90% of children, 85% live below the poverty line. It's a very high poverty district. So I was desperately worried. And there's, to be clear, their scores are still nowhere near where they should be. A long way to go, but they recovered much faster than most. So that was pretty interesting to me.
Um, Real quickly, colleges across the country are losing hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. Obviously, Columbia has been the face of this, losing 400 million before kind of conceding to some of the Trump administration's demands about changes to be made. But look, I have a daughter at the University of Chicago where you're affiliated, and they have really stayed far from these political fights. And my daughter, who literally has colleagues who are trying to cure cancer, I'm not exaggerating, like that's their goal. They've said funding has disappeared for research, and it is a massive competition. How are these colleges across the country going to be impacted? And ultimately, when we're talking about research, what is the impact of all of that money, and much of it through USAID, NIH, and things of that nature? How will it impact us down the road?
Yeah, and I have very strong and maybe controversial opinions on this, so happy to push back. I'm biased. My dad taught at the University of Chicago. I grew up on campus. I still live on campus. So yeah, your daughter's in my mind, is an extraordinary world-class institution. But when you're walking away from fundamental research, whether it's on cures for cancer, like you said, I talked to a colleague someplace else who they are looking at ways of having AIDS go into remission overseas, and they have had to stop those trials. You can't just start that back up again, and it's just like the human toll here and the loss of life potentially, where we have answers or we're getting close to answers, is staggering. So here's my opinion, and again, everyone may not agree. Um, Trump is always about revenge and retribution, and so I can't prove this, but if you do your homework, you'll look at, going back, 20 years or so, uh, Trump tried to sell land to Columbia University for $400 million, and they walked away, and he stormed out of that meeting and called them dumb and crazy. And I look at what he did. I'm like, how did you come up with $400 million? Where did that number come from? That's a mind-boggling high number. And then the research comes out, and he thought, they screwed him for $400 million back 20 years ago. And so there's no, in the, if there was a concern at Columbia, and again, there may well be concerns at Columbia, that would take a real investigation by the Office of Civil Rights. And that takes to gather evidence, they do research, they figure out. None of that happened. This just came up overnight. No investigation, no whatever. $400 million, a staggering amount of money. And oh, guess what? He was mad they didn't buy land from him, back in the day for exactly $400 million. And so this is how he's always about revenge and retribution. And so it's easy for me to say I'm not a university president, but I hate that they conceded to his demands. And to be clear, he did not give them the $400 million back. It just opened the door to having conversations. And whether it's there, the other day, University of Michigan closed their Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. So I'll just give you my take, is that universities have to band together. Thinking they can remain silent, he's going to just keep coming after them, coming after the more elite institutions. He always comes after universities with female presidents first. There's a real sexist part of this strategy. It's not lost on anybody. As you know, they cost the president of Harvard her job going back 2 years or whatever. President of Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, same thing. So what I would do, and this is again a little radical, he says I'm going to take $400 million for Columbia. Two options. I would have Columbia say we're going to dip into our endowment and get that $400 million. Or I would love to see 3,000 university presidents stand up and say, this is not tenable, and we're all going to fight this together. And I'd love to see 400 universities all give Columbia $1 million to keep them whole. And it's like you have to form a mutual aid society. And this is thinking very, very differently But universities that think they can like keep quiet and hide under a rock and that he won't come hit them, this is in his political interest. People who go to college, by and large, don't vote for President Trump, and so this is not his base. And he is not in his interest to have a well-educated citizenry. And so this attack is going to continue. And the more folks concede and concede like preemptively, for me, it's a tremendous sign of weakness. And Trump is just he's a classic schoolyard bully. And you have to stand up to a bully. And the more, if he takes your lunch money, at school one day and you just give it to him, he's going to come back and take it the next day and the next day and the next day. He's not going to stop until you stand up to him. And so they have to stand up for their survival. And I look at places like like Turkey, where an authoritarian leader comes in and the university system there basically crumbles because the authoritarian leaders absolutely want to attack higher education. And so I'm desperately worried about, we're starting down that path now. And universities are used to be, revered and respected and, being on a pedestal and maybe a little bit of an ivory tower feel. And this is schoolyard, bullying. This is dealing with a guy who gets his playbook from the mob, and just conceding to those kinds of figures is not a recipe for success. So it's a long answer, but I'm very, very, very concerned, not just K to 12, but about what's going to happen to our system of higher education, which is absolutely the best in the world and may start to disappear before our very eyes.
Wow, that is eye-opening, Arnie. I'm really glad that you brought that to all of our attention and to all of our viewers' attention. That is fascinating. We need to look into connecting those dots.
The real estate dots are fascinating. I'm just curious, a political question, and I'll use a basketball reference that I know you'll understand. Rick Pitino famously said, Larry Bird is not walking through that door. And the same goes for the Democratic Party. Barack Obama ain't walking through that door. Who is the person you think that can turn things around, that can communicate with people in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin in the middle of the country and engage that working class?
That's a great question. I'm the policy guy. I care about kids and education. I've never run for dog catcher, so I'm not a super informed opinion here, but I'll just give you my my honest best thinking. I spent the last 2 days in DC. I went there from Mississippi, met with leadership on the Hill, Congress, Senate. I'm always honest. My honest take is that most Americans really dislike DC. They really don't like DC. And what you've seen of people who voted for Barack and then voted for Trump, it's like, how does that happen? They're both seen as outsiders. They're seen as outsiders. They're seen as challenging the system. And so, for my mind, the idea of having a single center of gravity in DC, which lots of people are asking for, and I understand that, I actually think that's the wrong thing, because I think most Americans, or many Americans, don't trust DC. What on the Democratic side is you have a number of very, very good governors. And so whether it's Whitmer in Michigan, whether it's Pritzker here in Illinois, whether it's Shapiro in Pennsylvania that you mentioned, whether it's Wes Moore in Maryland and Andy Beshears in Kentucky, you have very, very good governors who actually have to solve problems, real world problems every day in their states. And for me, while it'd be simpler to have a single voice, for me, what would be smart to do would be to elevate a number of 5, 6, 7 governors, talk about what they're doing to help their constituents, their citizens every single day across the political spectrum. Talk about the damage Trump is doing, and I think that collective voice has more credibility than any voice coming from DC. I think what people crave now more than ever is authenticity. And those governors have to speak authentically because they're in the real world. They're not in the DC bubble.
I think he's just given us a great programming suggestion for Sanity to collect some of the governors and talk about what they're doing.
I'd love to come on and encourage. I'd love to come on and encourage them to work together. Right. So I haven't shopped this. I'm putting them on the spot without having those conversations. But that's yeah. Anyway, I'd be very, very curious.
A few of them for us, we'd love to have them on. If I could stay with the basketball storylines. I know you're a former professional. You played at Harvard. I'm just curious your thoughts on the NCAA tournament, the impact of the millions of dollars, NIL, which is pay for play, transfer portal, which is free agency every year. What has been the impact to you, a basketball fan, on the sport we all know and love?
Yeah, well, I wish there was an NIL when I was playing, but I would probably would have been lucky to get a free lunch. Nobody would have paid me much for what I was doing. So again, this is probably as complicated as it politically. Um, the system before was absolutely not fair to players. To have players not benefit when universities are making millions, not just on their performance on the court or the playing field or the football field, but make millions from their jersey sales and having their names on the back of jerseys. That was fundamentally not fair. It was not fair that college coaches could leave in a moment's notice and go make millions of dollars someplace else, and players were stuck. Um, Unfortunately, the NCAA has no ability to regulate themselves. And I co-chaired something called the Knight Commission that made a number of recommendations. And from a governance standpoint, the NCAA is broken and just was never able to get outside of its own way. There was never any independent directors on the NCAA. I think it was like 60 something members, and they always vote for what makes sense financially, not what makes sense. It's always student athletes, the student part first. It's just like stunning to me in the Big Ten for the women. The Big Ten championship was between UCLA and USC. Two West Coast teams playing for the Big Ten championship, and to have these kids traveling across the country, not just in the big sport, but in swimming and diving and field hockey and lacrosse, traveling across the country, missing days of schools to go play. This is all about just revenue generation for universities. No academic leadership there. So my answer, which is not, again, none of this is clean, is basically where you have the Power Five, the big dogs. I would just let them go do their own thing, basically professionally, which is what they're doing now. Basketball and football, make money, do whatever, but have every other sport in those conferences play regionally so that parents can go to games and fans can go to games. And you're not traveling 6 hours on a plane to go play someplace. And 95% of college sports, 97%, I think is extraordinary. And I always say that I think, the military is probably our best leadership development, system in the country. But college athletics is probably the second. Like all the lessons I learned about leadership, I learned on the basketball court. And so the big picture is not broken for the vast majority. It's broken at the top. Let them go be professional, semi-professional, whatever you call it. They're making millions. That's fine. But let everyone else, let the student athlete part, the student part resonate first, and focus on creating not the next generation of pros, but the next generation of leaders for our country.
Yeah, Charlie Baker's got his hands full. Quickly, who wins your national title? I know you filled out a bracket.
Yeah, I'm the wrong guy. I don't watch any games during the year, so I'm guessing.
Oh.
So I picked St. John, so I can't lie to you. I'm dead in the water. I watched Florida for a minute. They looked really good. Duke is tough, but I am a very uninformed fan, to be honest. But yeah, my bracket got broken real early.
Arne, this has been great. We've really gotten our money's worth from you on all of these topics. Thanks for opining. At the end of our podcast, we always ask our guests for their dose of sanity in these maddening times. What do you do to stay sane?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and this is a time of extraordinary stress and trauma and fear. And my day job is I work to reduce gun violence in Chicago every day. I've done it for the past 8 years. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. I'm out in the streets and dealing with some very, very, crazy and difficult situations. So my life was already pretty stressful, and it's gone to a different level now. And so I think it's not a time to be silent. It's a time that you have to push back and fight. And I know people feel fear, and honestly, I feel fear every day. It's the nature of what I do every day. I'm so thankful every night when I'm able to come home safely. I don't take it ever for granted. So for me, it's not about whether you're scared or not. I'm candidly scared every day, but it's what you do with that fear. And do you let it paralyze you, or do you sort of work through it and push through it and try to make things better? Whether it's me locally in Chicago, or now I'm spending more and more time nationally. That's why I'm talking to you, because I'm so worried for not just for our education system, but for our country and for our country's democracy. So I think if you're doing that, you have to counter that with other things that give you, energy and strength. So I still play, I play ball every morning. I played ball this morning with a group of guys been playing for, 30 years together. We're all older and slower, but still great camaraderie, and spent time in community with the Emerson Collective that I'm a part of in DC for the past 2 days. And I think there's a lot of strength. It may not be, I would say, it may not be safety in numbers, but there's strength in numbers, and just being connected to people on a human level, spending time with my family, with my wife and kids, spending time with people I love. That's what sustains me and gives me energy, and it's always important. But I think when you're under so much stress and worry, you have to do more of those things that sustain you. And I'm trying to do that, not perfectly, but very consciously making the effort, honestly, every single day to keep that balance. That's a great question.
Well, thanks for everything
And
you
that's
do.
a great answer.
It's a great answer. Your sanity is infectious, I hope. So,
do you ever drink the Arne Duncan, excuse me? I poured a few because I wanted to ask you about it. Is this actually a thing?
I don't even know what you're talking about.